guys, video number 2. All right. Okay, so we talked about plate tectonics, and now we're going to talk about the different types of landforms. So I asked you to name 4 different landforms. Okay. I hope you recognize them. Number 1 was a mountain. Number 2 was a volcano. Number 3 was a trench, and number 4 was a canyon. Now, each of these landforms are very different, but I chose these 4 because 2 and 2, they each have similarities and they look pretty similar. Okay. What I want to do though is I want to break them and I want to talk about 3 and 1. Okay. Now, one of these landforms is formed through processes of erosion and weathering. Okay. And then the other 3 are made through different processes. Okay. Now, the one that was made through weathering and erosion is landform number 4, a canyon. A canyon is created through weathering and erosion. So we have picture number 4. It's not just any canyon, it's actually the Grand Canyon. Okay. The Grand Canyon was formed through erosion and weathering of the Colorado River, or from the Colorado River to the rock. Okay. So bits and pieces of the rock would be broken off from the rapids and moving water and then taken downstream and deposited elsewhere. Okay. This over a long period of time created a deep ravine and turned into a canyon. Okay. This is breaking down and sculpting of the landform or the earth surface. Okay. The other ones were not broken down in that same process. Okay. Talking about number 1 and 2, they were brought up. Okay. Not through, if you remember, a process called deposition, where soil and dirt are deposited, not through that. Okay. These next 3 were made through processes or interactions of their surface, like we just talked about in my last video. So we talked about the different boundary types and how they interacted and what they did. Okay, now the first one I want to talk about, which I find is the most interesting, maybe, I guess that's opinion, but would be the convergent boundary. That's when we have 2 boundaries or 2 plates and they're coming together. Okay, and if you think about it, if you put your hands and you're pushing together, they're either going to come up like this. You see my fingers? That's where we get mountains and volcanoes. They can either go like this, and we can have what's called subduction, which I'm not going to test you on something like that, but this is whenever one is pushed up under. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to talk about whenever they come together and they push like that. Okay. And that's where we find landforms such as mountains and volcanoes. Now, we know that mountains and volcanoes are very different, okay? But they do have their similarities. They're both elevated landforms. They have a peak most of the time, okay? But mountains don't have lava and magma. Pretty simple, right? Okay, let's go to the next one. So number 3. Number 3 is made or created through boundary points. We have a trench. Now, if you can see, there's a gap. Like, here's the 2 plates. We have a gap. Okay. This one is obviously not created through convergent. We don't see 2 plates pushing against each other. They're obviously separated, right? This is caused through the divergent boundary points, where they're pulling away from each other, right? Pulling away. We see the gap right there. So we have a divergent boundary. I wanted to drive this home because we have 2, if you look at 3 and 4, we have 2 very similar landforms, or they look very similar, but they are not created through the same process. 4 is through the long-term process of breaking down and moving. And then we have 3, which is long-term, but it's just the plates pulling apart and moving away from one another. So the Earth's surface is changed, and it's dirt is moved, or soil is moved, sediment's moved, and we have the breaking down, we have the building up. Our Earth is constantly changing, and it's not just one process that plays a part in this. The world is constantly changing through different processes that are either creating new land, breaking down land. For example, number 2, volcanoes. Usually when we think of volcanoes, we think of destruction. We think of fire, we think of hot. we think of forest burning, destruction, but volcanoes are like the birth of new land. Whenever the lava comes down and it finally cools, when it goes to, like, let's say it's Hawaii, and it touches the ocean, it's going to cool, and it actually can spread out the land we have. So processes like weathering and erosion are breaking it down, and then we have things like volcanoes that are building it up. It's a constant process, okay? So let's go ahead and move on to the next stuff.